Hi there.
Hi.
It's so nice to finally connect.
Thank you. Thank you very much that you find the time to meet us.
No, it's a pleasure. I'm sorry it took so long.
First of all, Leilani, I would like to apologize and please excuse me, my English is not perfect and during this conversation maybe I will do some mistakes.
No worries at all. No worries.
I'm glad that today we have such a special guest in our university in Alterbridge, Leilani Farha. I'm afraid that in Georgia there are small number of people who knows about Leilani, but believe me, she is well known in many countries because of her active work in the field of adequate housing. So today, Leilani is a global director of global movement, The Shift, which she launched in 2017 with great support of Ada Colau, the mayor of Barcelona. And the main goal of this movement is to restore the understanding of housing as a human right, not a commodity or an extractive industry. From 2014 to 2020, for 6 years, Leilani was United Nations Special Rapporteur on adequate housing. She was always concentrated on subjects which were related to human rights. And last but not least, what I want to say about her, that she was involved in creating the documentary The Push film, which was created by Swedish filmmaker Fredrik Gertten. And the film is about the adequate housing issues all around the world. And I suggest to watch this documentary because I think it's best documentary what I have seen related to these issues. So Leilani, thank you once again for taking time to meet us. And could you briefly tell us about the housing problems and the term of adequate housing? Sure. Because in some countries, and unfortunately Georgia belongs to these countries, housing and adequate housing means if you have roof over the head, and it does not matter what kind of conditions there are, and so on. So please.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to join you and for this conversation. It's so important that we have these conversations in every country. And of course, I didn't manage to visit Georgia when I was the UN Special Rapporteur, but now because of COVID, we visit every country like that. And so now I'm in Georgia, which is fantastic. There is a global housing crisis. This I am certain of, and it existed before the pandemic. Now we have to use the pandemic as a timeline before pandemic and after pandemic. Hopefully there will be after. But the housing crisis was very strong prior to the pandemic, and it continues with the pandemic, and I think it will be worse after the pandemic. Okay. So what is the crisis? The crisis is around adequacy, exactly as you said, and adequacy means much more than just, do I have four walls and a roof? One of the things I noticed when I was first rapporteur in 2014, I started to read more internationally, travel a little bit more, and every city that I visited or that I read about was experiencing what we call an affordability problem, where rents are escalating, going really, really high, but household income is remaining quite flat. And so every city has this graph, we say like this. So these are housing costs, this, and this is income. And obviously it's that gap that is the affordability crisis. And that was happening everywhere. So for me, I was interested to know, why is this happening? And of course, I learned through research and through discussions, and that of course, part of it is related to how housing has become an instrument of finance and financial actors rather than understood as a social good like healthcare or education. So there's other issues of adequacy or lack of adequacy that I've seen in countries around the world. Obviously, many countries, almost every country, has homelessness. Homelessness is the most, the biggest violation of the right to housing, of course. It's as a lawyer, we say it's a prima facie violation because there's no other way to describe it but a prima facie violation of the right to housing because you have no housing at all. You're homeless. Homelessness is on the rise in most countries, including in Eastern Europe and Western Europe. But it's everywhere. I mean, I was in Nigeria fairly recently and there's homelessness in Nigeria. I mean, there's homelessness everywhere, in every country. Other adequacy issues, I mean, some people really don't have four walls and a roof, like people living in homelessness. There's a lot of informal settlements, what we call informal settlements or encampments, homeless encampments. And that's true in Europe as well, particularly for Roma population, who are often living in some of the worst conditions, and other migrants and refugees, often without water and sanitation, for example, or electricity. The issue of evictions, both forced eviction and eviction, is a very real experience, also goes against adequacy. You can't have adequate housing if you feel like you might be evicted. That's not adequate. If you feel nervous and stressed about eviction, whether it's eviction because of rental arrears, so you can't pay your rent, or whether it's forced eviction where you're living in an encampment or informal settlement and the state wants to push you, or any level of government wants to push you off that land. That fear, that insecurity means you have inadequate housing. One thing I'm interested to know about Georgia, which I don't know, and I'm quite interested to know if in Georgia, like in other Eastern European countries, whether the idea of housing as a commodity is strong. Is that how it's being treated? Because I have been to, for example, Serbia and Kosovo, and there was no doubt that it's related to the fall of socialism and communism. There's like an uber capitalistic approach to housing. And so I'm interested to know, how does it play out in Georgia?
I think it's nearly the same as in Serbia. Yesterday, there was a screening of the push organized by the Rotterdam University. After this screening, there was some discussion, and during discussion I said that there is no problem of rent in Georgia because there are only few people who rents apartments.
Right.
Everyone tries to buy it, and then I realized that why does it happen? Because rent prices are so high that there is no
incentive to rent. It's better to
rent.
buy.
Everybody tries to buy because it's nearly the same, and sometimes it's higher than the payment for the mortgage, you know.
Right.
But of course, there are very small percentage of Georgians who can buy house without mortgage. And I think that at least half of Georgians, they are afraid to lose.
Yes.
Because it's not a stable economic situation here, and we don't know what will happen tomorrow. And this pandemic
makes it worse. Absolutely. George, I mean, it's very disturbing to me. Oh, I mean, we could talk about the pandemic a lot, but most places were in this housing crisis before the pandemic.
Yeah, the same was here, yeah.
Yes. And then governments, and I'm sure it's the same as in Georgia, government said, because what else could they say? The response to the pandemic is to stay home and to wash your hands and to physical distance. Well, so it means everyone knows now that housing is so important to well-being and health and life itself. And it's putting a lot of pressure on housing in a situation where housing was in crisis. You know, so it's created a very worrisome situation because people are underemployed now or unemployed. And how are they going to pay their mortgages? How are they going to pay their rent when they're renting? And if you can't pay your mortgage, I don't know what the mortgage companies are saying in Georgia or what the government is saying in Georgia, but in most places it's not forgiveness. There's no mortgage forgiveness. So at the end of the pandemic, all the banks and lenders are going to expect people to be paying back what they couldn't pay during the pandemic. And will people be able to do that? Will they be in default of their mortgage? And then will they lose their homes? I mean, it's a serious issue, and not so many people are talking about it. Of course, the people who have the mortgages and are renting, they are talking about it, but governments are not talking about it enough. I'm quite worried.
Same situation is in Georgia, that the banks and the mortgage companies, they postponed for some clients for 3 months, for some of them for 6 months, but they don't forgive. You have to pay this amount and nobody knows what will happen after 6 months. Leilani, I first time hear about this position, UN Special Rapporteur of Adequate Housing, when I saw The Push, the film. Could you say about this position? I understand that it is related to adequate housing and to make some research and et cetera, but a little bit in details, what was your responsibilities?
Sure. So the UN has in place a system called the special procedures, and it involves the appointment of many independent experts. There's, I think, over 50, maybe 53, and they appoint in different areas. So some are thematic areas. So for example, I was appointed as special rapporteur for 2 3-year terms from 2014 till April 2020. And my thematic area was the right to adequate housing. There is also a rapporteur on extreme poverty. There's one on the right to food. There's one on the right to health. There's one on the right to water, etc. And we're appointed as I said, independent experts. So we don't represent government. We don't represent the United Nations. We don't represent an NGO. We don't represent our own countries. We are completely independent. Our job is to act like a global watchdog. In my case, I was the global watchdog on the right to housing. I was monitoring and trying to assess whether people around the world enjoy the right to housing, and if they don't, why not? What does that look like? And at the same time, I was trying to work with governments to ensure they meet their international human rights obligations. We had different mechanisms to do that. You can visit a country. You have to be invited by the government to do so. And there's only resources to go to 2 countries a year maximum. So it's small, but still. And that's an intensive, you go for 10 or 12 days, you do an intensive investigation, you write a report, you make recommendations to the government, you present that to the United Nations, so that government has to appear before their peers and defend their record and also admit their weaknesses and hopefully make some change. that doesn't happen as often as you might like, or I might like. And then we also had the opportunity to write thematic reports. So every rapporteur is different because we're all independent. I really felt it was useful to provide governments with and NGOs with some tools. So most of my reports were very pragmatic. My very final report was a set of guidelines for the implementation of the right to housing. So if any government wants to implement the right to housing, I've given them a template. I also wrote a set of sort of principles around a national housing strategy, or excuse me, housing strategies, not necessarily national. So, you know, if a government, local or national, wants to adopt a housing strategy, this is what it would look like if it was human rights compliant. And I you know, provided a sort of systematic demonstration of what should be included. And then we had another mechanism. I shouldn't say we, I'm no longer the rapporteur, but the rapporteurs have a mechanism that's called a communication mechanism. And that's when you write a formal legal letter to a government or to another actor where you believe that they have been engaged in behavior that is contrary to international human rights law, in particular the right to housing. And so I used that, you know, if I'd heard of an eviction that was happening. I did a whole number of communications on homelessness. I wrote to some of the big financial actors and asset management firms engaged in housing who I thought were violative of the human right to housing. And that's really just an exchange of letters, but it opens up a dialogue. So there's a variety of mechanisms. And then I also used my position to visit as many cities as I could in an unofficial capacity to give lectures and meet with local, and I would use that as an opportunity to meet with local groups, visit encampments or other housing circumstances, shelters, and et cetera, to get an understanding of what's happening on the ground.
Yeah. And Leilani, what do you think, what's your feeling that, how effective it was in the push? I watched it several times, and every time there was a dual feeling. One, very optimistic, because such a great, how to say, information and such a great presentation of this problems with very simple words that everyone could understand, that it's so simple, yes, that it's a human right. First of all, it's human, and then everything else, the corporations and business and profits, etc., etc. But second feeling was a little bit pessimistic because of, you know, during your speech in UN, you can see that some persons who has to be more concentrated on what you're talking about. Yes, they're so relaxed. The one guy is looking for this watch and the price of this watch, and you know, it's so disgusting, you know. And do you feel that it has done some practical changes in some countries or in some cities, you know?
Yeah, I mean, of course, making change is very difficult, and a six-year period is small, actually, especially because you spend your first few months trying to understand the job, and then there's the job of you have to write 2 thematic reports a year, and that takes up a lot of time. So I feel like I actually had quite a large influence, and it surprises me. The influence maybe isn't where or how I thought it would be. I have seen some government change, for sure. For sure. I mean, you know, maybe not, like when you come into the position, you're like, I want every government to adopt a rights-based housing strategy. And of course it's ridiculous, and you know it's ridiculous, but I do have governments that are really interested in looking at the human right to housing as a new approach to housing. So especially at city level, of course, because the city level governments are on the front lines. They're really feeling the housing crisis. They're having to deal with the housing crisis, and they don't have the capacity, they don't have the resources. They're looking for a new model, something new. They need something new because old approaches are not working with these new actors and with the new realities. And so I have found a lot of appetite at the city level. I mean, right now, for example, I have a pilot project in Canada. Yesterday, I had a call with cities from around the country, I think 12 cities, and with mayors, and we were all talking about the right to housing and how to implement it at the local level. So that would not have happened 6 years ago. So I'm seeing shifting landscape. The government of Mexico has contacted me. They're very interested in a human rights-based approach to housing. Of course, Spain has been grappling with, and they've had so many changes in governments, but not just Barcelona, because Ada is the big, Mayor Colau is a big supporter of the right to housing, but at national level, the national level government is trying to be more progressive and human rights oriented. So we're seeing some movement. Denmark just passed really interesting legislation to try to push back against financialization. And because they have Blackstone, for example, this company that's referenced in the film, the largest private equity firm in the world, in the area of residential real estate especially. So Denmark just passed a law to freeze rents for 5 years, which creates a hostile environment for the investors who want a quick return on investment. And it's actually called the Blackstone Law, just like casually, because that was the intention, was really to create a different environment to keep those actors out. And that's really the result, not just of my work as rapporteur, although I think I contributed, but also because of the film Push. You see, it had its world premiere in Copenhagen, and there was already activism against Blackstone. And we used the film and the activism and media to really create some momentum. And there was an election at the same time. So we helped to create this feeling that this was an election issue, this is a media issue, this is an issue affecting everyday people. They elected a more progressive government, and now look, they have this more progressive legislation. We're seeing a lot of movement in Germany, in Berlin.
In Berlin,
there's real activism. The folks in Kreuzberg, but in Berlin, but other places as well. In Berlin, I mean, in Germany, they're doing some really interesting actions at the local level. Residents they're going into different cities and they're asking the question, who owns our cities? Who owns our housing? There, they don't have public registry of land. So you can't, in many countries, you can go to a land registry office and you can look up every address and find out who owns the property. In Germany, that's not public. And so the tenants themselves are learning who owns their own property, the properties they're living in. It's a very exciting project, because once you know who owns, you can then figure out which owners are causing which tenants the problems. So I'm seeing all sorts of, this is all new in the last few years. And I would like to think that as rapporteur, I've had something to do with that. My language has been very clear and strong. Housing is a human right, not a commodity. I'm actually not the first rapporteur to say it. My predecessor, Raquel Rolnick from Brazil, she said it too. Maybe, and in fact, the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights said it way back in the 1980s when they wrote a document called General Comment Number 4, not very sexy name, General Comment Number 4. It also says this: housing is a human right, not a commodity. Not quite that short, but the sentiment is there. Mm-hmm. I happen to be a person who likes to talk to media. I happen to be involved in Push, the film. So it enabled me to really put forward that message at a global scale at a time when people wanted to hear it. You know? So I think the conversation has changed entirely. George, I would not be having this conversation 6 years ago.
Yeah.
So I think that's how we make change, is by having these new conversations and generating new conversations. And I mean, a documentary film is an amazing vehicle for getting a message out. I'm just one person. This film can reach, how many people can I reach alone? It's very difficult. You know, how many Skype calls can I have? How many cities can I visit? But a film can travel the world instantaneously, and hundreds and thousands of people can view it. So, so in that way, I think we are changing the conversation, and that's how we're going to make change.
Yeah, I'd like to say that after our first time, so this documentary, first thought was it is necessary to show this documentary to schools, to universities, to new generations, to understand it in a different way.
I think that's right.
Yeah. So, and for me, it's a great film, to be honest.
Thank you so much. And I will pass that along to Frederick, the director. A lot of people think I had something to do with the film. I had nothing to do with the film. I just appear, that's not true, but I just appear in the film. The film was really the work of Frederick Urchin and his editor, Eric, who were able to make it so clear and make the issue so easy to understand.
Yeah, to understand. Yeah, it's very,
yeah. And one thing that's interesting, George, is we find young audiences, like young people, really like the film. So the film has won awards, like the young audience award, and I think it's because young people can see what's not on their future, in their future. They can see, I'm never going to be able to afford. No young person can imagine affording an apartment in Manhattan. Young people used to dream, I'm going to move to New York or Los Angeles, right? I mean, this was like, for a lot of young people, a dream. I'm going to move to Paris. I'm going to move to London. Those places are no longer available to young people. You can't imagine that you can move to those places and have a life because it's too expensive. And so the film resonates that way with young people. They're like, wait a second, why is this? How come I'm being prohibited from moving where I'd like to move? And, you know, young people are dreaming. They should be dreaming. And those dreams are being cut off from them. And the film really exposes that. So I agree with you. And so you must keep showing it. Show it in Georgia. You know, we have subtitles available. So
I would like to contact Frederick Gerten and to have the same kind of conversation with him. And maybe in that conversation, I will ask about the rights for showing this film. And
I can make an introduction to you and Frederick, no problem.
Oh,
it's no problem.
With great support.
Absolutely, no problem. We would have done the interview together, actually. We often do the interviews together.
In 2006 in New York, the guys, they showed me the place in Manhattan. They told me a story that that place was some period ago. It was very popular among the Bohemian young people, like starting actors, starting artists, starting writers who will try to make some career. But it became so popular that these companies like Blackstone, they raised the prices of rent, and these guys went to different places. The same happened there, and again and again. So the question, who are cities for? Yes, it's the main question.
When I asked that question in the film, and still I get a little bit sad about that. It makes me, I get like choked, you know, because people are being denied. You know, living is so hard now.
Yeah.
Like literally staying alive is so hard now. It's hard because, you know, if you can't afford rent, then where do you live? Like, and we know there are certain things that are essential for human life, and the pandemic has exposed it more than ever. Home is essential for human life. Mm-hmm. Food is essential for human life. Water is essential for human life. And if we're making all of that difficult for people,
yeah, and
it's an extinction. It's an extinction process.
But you're right that this changes in some cities like Berlin, like you say, the cities in Canada and Mexico and in Denmark, in Netherlands. You know, if it starts, sometimes it takes too long to make first movement, and when it starts, it's very difficult to stop it. You know, and if it starts in some cities, I'm sure that it will be then exploded to other cities as well. How Georgia or Tbilisi can participate in this movement?
Shift? I mean, I don't know what your mayor is like. We always like to try to, the shift likes to try to engage mayors. Not all mayors are always wanting to look at different approaches to housing. So, you know, if we can't engage the mayor, we can't engage the mayor. The shift would like to work with academics and NGOs in many countries. So if there are people like you, George, but also others who might like to connect with the shift and figure out how to start introducing human rights into the housing work more with more energy and with the backing of an international movement, I'm happy to do that and to have those connections made. I don't have any connections in Georgia, to be honest. So now you're my first connection. If you film the screen if you screen the film, if you show the film, push, then, you know, have a panel discussion afterward with me, Frederick, and a local activist or yourself, and we have an online discussion that can start creating some energy around the issues.
Leilani, again, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I'm sure that positive people like you will do positive changes. Maybe it will not be as fast as we would like. It needs a time.
Step by step. Yeah. Thank you so much, George. It was really lovely to connect with you. I'm happy we managed to finally connect. But please, let's stay in touch, because I'm very interested to know more about what's happening in Georgia. And as I said, I know Frederick would love for the film to be screened there many times, and we can do some panel presentations and discussions afterward. It would be great.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye.